So I just found out the most insane thing.
So he's being literal here. The thing that he's learned is something no sane person should believe.
I found out that the chief god of the Quraysh tribe, which Muhammad belonged to, was actually Baal.
I'm going to show you how confused Muslims are.
Okay, let's analyze this argument.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So today we're looking at this video. If you see that video and you want to see the completion of that video, then stick around. So we're looking at this Christian professor of philosophy and religion, Kelvin Carnahan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this name right, but this man is really amazing. And then you would see him defend Islam, try to show what our arguments are, and then he tries to defend Islam from Christian apologists, calling them ignoramuses and not really presenting our case the way it's meant to be. For example, one famous example that you would be watching inshallah is the argument about Allah doesn't really know what the Bible or the Torah entails. Then this man, that this is the Islamic dilemma, and this is really not representing the Muslim belief. Okay, then he explains what our stance are and what we believe. Another is when someone says we are asked to believe in the Gospels, and then he says this is not what the Muslims were asked to believe in. It says the gospel that was given to Jesus, and this is exactly what we keep saying. It's as if when it enters through one ear, it comes out through the other. So this is not our stand. This is not what we claim. This is not what we say. Rather, it is given to Jesus. If you can present that which was given to Jesus, good. And that would be amazing. But what people wrote, this is not what the Quran is talking about. So let's enjoy.
Just found out the most insane thing.
So he's being literal here. The thing that he's learned is something no sane person should believe.
I found out that the chief god of the Quraysh tribe, which Muhammad belonged to, was actually Baal, brought over from Syria. The name itself, Baal, was mixed in with the pagan moon god of the polytheist called Hubal. With Arabic, Hubal eventually became Hubalah.
Nope, the Arabic here was just Hubal,
which became Allah in Islam.
Nope, etymologically Allah comes from al-ilah. Ilah means God. It has the same etymological root as El, which is used to name God at many points in the Bible.
In other words, the god of Islam is actually Baal.
Even if his entirely made-up etymology did work, this wouldn't follow, because the meaning of a word follows from its use, not its etymology.
Which, as we know, according to the Old Testament, Baal is Satan.
The Old Testament never claims that Baal is Satan.
In fact, the moon god was traditionally a goddess.
For one, we really don't know anything about Hubal in pre-Islamic Arabia. Number two, I thought this was supposed to be Baal. Now it's a goddess?
But they flipped it in Islam to make him the chief deity amongst 6 other deities, worshipped at the Kaaba.
Islam is a monotheistic religion as it never worships 7 deities.
And of course, they're all fertility pagans, kissing the black stone, which is intentionally shaped like a you-know-what. Reminiscent of Asherah worship.
He clearly knows nothing about Asherah worship.
And the more I read, it seems that Muslims, when they go on the Hajj, they become self-aware of this pagan practice.
Okay, so let's review. The Arabs took Baal, a North Semitic storm god, but they took him as Satan, except for that they took him as Satan as a female moon god. And this made it into Islam despite their rejection of the worship of all of those gods that came before. Even if you knew nothing about Islam coming to this video, this pile of absurdity should give itself away as bullshit. There is no reason to make such a dumb video if it is not as Islamophobic clickbait. Jesus is disappointed. Do better.
I'm going to show you how confused Muslims are.
Okay, let's analyze this argument. Now we're going to get to the part where this guy understands neither Islam nor critically assesses his own tradition.
Y'all Muslims supposedly believe in the Torah and the prophets and the writings in the Old Testament, don't you?
So Muslims believe in the prophets represented in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, but they do not believe that those scriptures are a consistently accurate representation of the truth. The Quran and later Muslim tradition oftentimes corrects particular claims that Christians and Jews have in their scriptures. So no Muslim is obligated to buy into anything that contradicts their faith just because it is in the Hebrew or Christian Bible.
Psalms 22:1 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Matthew 27:46, before Jesus died on the cross and laid down his life, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Fulfilling the prophecy all the way written back from the Old Testament in the book of Psalms.
Imagine that I said, I am longing to see you, that I might share with you some spiritual gift. Now, that's a quote from Romans 1:11. And here I am on TikTok, seeing you. Have I just fulfilled a prophecy from Romans 1:11? No doubt my followers, assuming I had any followers, could pick up that text and claim that it was meant as a prophecy. And they could read all sorts of parallels into my activities and Paul's activities. And that interpretation of the text might take on authority within the community of my followers. But would there be any reason for people who are not in that community to find that a plausible reading? No, because those outside could point out that that text was not originally intended as a prophecy at all. It was just something Paul wrote to a church in Rome. And they could suggest that although there were parallels between my activity and Paul's, that's partially because I was following in a tradition of Paul, and partially because my followers looked for those parallels. My followers told my story so as to emphasize and align my story with the details of Paul's life. This story is an almost exact parallel to what this person has just quoted from the Psalms and from the Gospels. Jesus uses words from a psalm, which was not originally intended as a prophecy. Jesus' followers were familiar with the Psalms. They read the story of Jesus in light of the Psalms, and they sought to emphasize where that story overlapped with the story of the Psalms. But reading that as a prophecy is a distinctively Christian reading. There is certainly nothing that obligates Jews or Muslims, or even self-critical Christians, of reading it in exactly the same way.
Isaiah 53:5. Y'all say y'all follow Isaiah. Well, let's read this part. It says, but he was pierced for our transgressions.
The suffering servant passages from Isaiah were written as a reflection on the suffering of the people of Israel. They viewed themselves as the chosen people, and so though they suffered exile and oppression from foreign forces, the authors of Isaiah believed that the people of Israel occupied a special place in God's plan. Christians later took these verses, which were said about the people of Israel, and applied them to Jesus. Again, they were not prophecies until Christians read them that way. I could go on to address all the examples that this guy provides, but they're all basically the same. Not prophecies unless they are read in a Christian way. So there's no obligation for Jews or Muslims to read them that way.
John 10:18, Jesus said, no man takes my life. I lay it down. I have been given authority from my Father in heaven. But then he says, I have authority to take it back up. Hallelujah. Did your Muhammad do that?
No, and Muslims don't believe that Jesus did that either.
Seems kind of contradictory to me, huh? Your Quran says to believe the writings of the Old Testament.
It does not.
Now, what about your pedophile prophet now?
Muhammad was not a pedophile. This is hate-filled rhetoric, has no place in interreligious dialogue. Coming from the mouth of a person who calls himself Christian is an embarrassment.
Seems like it's quite contradictory. You'll never win this battle because the truth always prevails, and the truth is Jesus Christ. You better worship him as God, or you'll be in hell with Muhammad.
One cannot represent a God of love while spewing hatred and judgment. Jesus is disappointed. Do better.
The Quran seems to fundamentally not understand what the Torah and the Gospel are.
This Huff is about to break out the Islamic dilemma, which is apparently all the rage in Christian apologetics these days. Let's talk about why I don't think any Muslim has any reason to take it seriously at all. The argument is that the Quran tells Muslims that the Jewish and Christian scriptures are reliable, but the Jewish and Christian scriptures contradict the Quran. Therefore, according to the Quran, you should reject the Quran. The problem with the argument is is that it rests on an unnecessary and uncharitable reading of the Quran. Just look at one of the verses that the argument hangs on. We sent Jesus, confirming the Torah, and we sent him the gospel as guidance and exhortation to the reverent. Let the people of the gospel judge by what God has set down therein. There are three major problems with Christian apologists reading this as setting up the Muslim dilemma. First of all, the gospel, as referenced here, clearly does not refer to, say, the four gospels or the New Testament. The passage claims that the gospel was given to Jesus, but no one claims that the New Testament was given to Jesus. So it's entirely coherent for the Muslim to say that God guaranteed the message that God gave to Jesus, but does not guarantee the written scriptures of Christianity. Second, even if it were concerned with the written scriptures of these traditions, in this passage, the Quran is not focused on the narrative portions of those scriptures. It's focused on law and the judgment of behaviors. Third, the claim is not that Muslims should judge on the basis of the gospel and the Torah, but that Christians and Jews should judge on that basis. The assumption being that there are differences between the revelation to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. To get to their reading, Christian apologists have to ignore all of this in the text. It's just disingenuous. And while we're at it, Wes Huff should never present himself as any kind of authority on the Quran, because obviously he's only read it in the context of Christian apologetics. Jesus is disappointed. Do better.